Hello, this is a video I posted some time ago, the architectural language of Hermetic design, and it's basically I'm going to do a comparison of Sydney, Australia and Winnipeg in Winnipeg in Canada, Manitoba in Canada, and show a set of comparisons in between the architecture, town planning, as well as the design of parks and the decoration, such as in the sculptures and arrangement of those sculptures, and how they have very ancient connections, but also how they're very much connected through uh, Freemasonry, Rosicrucians, and the Oddfellows. The link, especially Frank Albo, has done some work on the Manitoba Legislative Building in Winnipeg, and for the most part I want to add to a little bit to it, but I've also have some disagreements in his interpretations of the street layout, and I believe by a comparison of firstly with Sydney but with many other cities around the world, that some of his conclusions can be shown to be not accidental or coincidental as he might claim, but part of a larger plan through the great cities, great capital cities of the world, and especially in connection to occult, esoteric symbols, and Hermetic. Now, when I say Hermetic, that comes from Hermes, also known as Mercury in Roman times. Hermes was the god of commerce, the god of weights and measures, and many other things, and travelling. So, for instance, in train stations and post offices, you'll see Hermetic symbols, especially the caduceus, the two snakes around the rod. But let's begin. So we're in Winnipeg, and out the front of the Manitoba Legislative Building we have Queen Victoria with a sceptre and orb. Both Sydney and both Australia and Canada are Commonwealth countries, so the inclusion, and given that these buildings were built at the time of Queen Victoria, it's no surprise that she would be there. But there's a deeper meaning to this because she's holding the sceptre and orb. So there are two important Queen Victoria statues, one in front of the Queen Victoria building. Again, she's this time seated, holding the sceptre and orb, and just outside St James, outside Hyde Park in Sydney, we see her standing with sceptre and orb. The sceptre and orb are royal symbols, which you'll see also going back to ancient times again. The sceptre is literally means a ruler, as in a ruler rules, but the ruler as in a foot or a meter. Connection to Virgo, she holds the rod of power and a sheaf of grain. Grains being used to define both weight and measure, and these are one of the powers of the symbols and the ancient connections. The sceptre is the ruler and the orb is the weight. So weights and scales, weights and measures. So it's we have a connection going there to Virgo, but we'll see through older art, Christian art, but also going back to ancient Greek times, such as the famous statue of Zeus with the rod, but also back to the Code of Hammurabi and the Magna Carta. Weights and measures were a huge importance to rulers, and Egyptian Book of the Dead, the importance of being honest with your weights and measures. Beyond just simple marketing. So for instance, a ruler would come in and his power was to define weights and measures. That was one of the key points, and with that he could define the rule of law and the scales of justice. So it's not just about measuring goods in the marketplace or defining the size of temples. It's also has connections to morality and being honest. In this video I won't go into the numbers very much, but just a quick reminder of the importance of 108 in regards to weights and measures. So Greco-Roman gods, the Manitoba Legislative Building, and we see up here the pediment on the top, and we get and from this angle you can see, you just get a hint of a golden boy or Hermes statue. You'll see this arrangement, though. Very many buildings will have this similar arrangement of gods, even, but slightly different variations. But Zeus, Europa, Athena, Amphitrite, the wife of Poseidon or Neptune, Apollo, the sun rays of Apollo. In some of so we can see Athena being a goddess of wisdom, but a goddess of war and especially defensive military. Again, in Sydney, you're going to see whatever's in Winnipeg, we're going to see reflected in Sydney. So, for instance, the fountain, such as the in Hyde Park, but also in the Royal Botanic Gardens, the Captain Arthur Phillip Fountain. Poseidon, Hermes, Neptune, also connections to so for instance, Neptune is a patron god of horse racing, and Delphinus strongly connected to Neptune through the legend of how he came about to be married to Amphitrite, and also in constellations. Delphinus is a constellation, and various such as Equus, literally right next to each other. So throughout these buildings, throughout the city and throughout the design, you got these references are over and over again. So usually if you're going to see one reference, you'll see it connected to another. You'll see the similar, so the House of the Temple in Washington, Manly in Sydney. You might think that that's represents a fish, but Delphinus is actually a dolphin or porpoise. And so again, it's pretty much, you look for a war memorial, you're going to see these symbols, or for a major building such as the Singapore Supreme Court building, City Hall in Brisbane. Each one of these is slightly different. They look. This is from Brussels. Important park there. There's some very nice connections throughout Brussels. It'd be hard to press to find a major capital city that doesn't have it, really. The fasces, that's the bundle of sticks wrapped around the axe, which is a Roman symbol, got to do with Roman power. So as I mentioned, so a lot of these symbols are also especially in the northern hemisphere, constellations. But at the top of the Manitoba Legislative Building, we have a Hermes reference, and there are 4 sculpture sets around each side. The official explanation for them will be has some, like, well, for instance, science, agriculture, and so forth. But you're going to see multiple references to Greco-Roman gods, such as in Fortuna's wheel. So here we see a collection of what their official names are, but what they represent as well is the 4 elements: fire, earth, water, and air. This is something that's consistent. So just as whatever is in Winnipeg, you'll see it in one form repeated in Sydney, as these 2 cities have very strong connections regarding esoteric origins and the occult. But for instance, the industry, the main sculpture there, you see he's got a cloth band around his head. What it is, it's hiding the eye, the third eye of Hephaestus, the Roman god of fire, a Greek god of fire, also called Vulcan in Roman mythology. And so we look at this cluster here in Winnipeg, and then we go to the Captain Arthur Phillip Fountain in the Royal Botanic Gardens in Sydney, and we have a similar arrangement where again we'll have Delphinus, Hermes, Vulcan. You can, if you look closely at the statue, there's actually the third eye on his brow can be just seen there, as where the Winnipeg one, it's a little bit concealed behind the headband that he's wearing. Hermes, as in hermaphrodite, doesn't have to be male all the time. You're gonna Hermes is he's known to be a shifty character, or she as well. So Hermes can be represented as male or female. But the important symbol is the caduceus, the 2 snakes around the rod, which most often gets connected to science and medicine. And that's another thing which Hermes is important for commerce, weights and measures, travel, but also he's the god of science. Very strong connection to the Egyptian god Thoth, who is the same sort of origins. He's the bringer of knowledge. He's basically the god of Egyptian science. And so we do a little comparison where we find the same symbols, the same gods, and the same, yes, Hermetic symbolism, let's call it. So on top we see the golden boy on top, very similar. The July column in Paris you'll also see similar, but Captain Arthur Phillip is holding the scroll. That's an alternative symbol for Hermetic knowledge, and also the way his hands are holding the flag. Especially the older artworks, Albrecht Dürer or around that Renaissance period, you're going to see their fingers are at strange and odd angles. They're actually giving symbols, very much like gang signs that we flash now. It's just sort of been lost over time. So here we see the July column in France, and how similar it is to the Golden Boy in Winnipeg. But the Louvre and in Versailles, again, with a female form holding the caduceus. Belgrade in Serbia, so now would be a little bit of a slideshow. I'm just going to go around just to show how pervasive this is across the world. Vienna is another one of these sites where multiple references, again, the caduceus in Budapest. Department of Commerce in Washington. Now the foreign and domestic, that's a clue there, but that's for something else. Jefferson City in Missouri. It's one of these, in earlier episodes I've been talking about City Beautiful, Grand Central Terminal especially, I talked about before regarding the connections to weights and measures, and also the Manhattan Bridge, both of them including 120 feet, which is 1,440 inches. Also Chicago I've been mentioning a lot, especially regards to Daniel Burnham and City Beautiful. And now we come to the second main sculpture, Hermetic sculpture in Sydney, the Lady of Commerce, and also, as I mentioned, in Oranda Park in Brussels. Though in China you're going to find these things as well, so it's very curious how supposedly very separate cultures, very separate times have these Hermetic symbols again and again, such as a small fountain not too far from my hometown in Liverpool. It's not just about big cities, it's also about smaller towns. If you find one of these types of sculptures, you can look and you'll find that the others are repeated again. So we have the caduceus, but also there was a quick glimpse of Fortuna's wheel, and also the beehive, another very strong Oddfellow occult Freemasonic symbol, as well as the cornucopia. You might have noticed it, I didn't mark it out there. I'd like to thank Neil S. for sending these pictures. He went around Rochester in New York, and again we see the same arrangement where Apollo and Hermes, if you read up on it, the story of Hermes and Apollo being brothers, and that's how the lyre, how Apollo got his lyre, and Hermes received a caduceus from Apollo, so they swapped gifts. So the snake about the rod, and we see the origins from Thoth, where he has a bird head, as where Hermes and Mercury have wings on their feet, but they both carry the double snake symbol. Also Anubis, so Denver Airport, the Anubis statue, if you're familiar with that, Anubis weighed the souls, literally it's a connection with weights and measures. The god Hermanubis is a fusion of Hermes and Anubis. Weights and measures, the rod he's holding, very often scepter and orb, or a variation of it. So you'll often see a Hermes statue might be holding a small block, so like a block of iron, which is a weights and measure reference. The same thing in Mithraic cults and the Phrygian cap, but we're going to see Apollo and Artemis, or the sun and the moon gods, weights and measures, the Phrygian cap, as we can see here. And the Phrygian cap is a symbol very important in the French Revolution, American Revolution, but we also can see how in these South American, Central American nations throughout the US it's a standard. Goes back in time. It's a symbol really about free slave. A freed slave would wear the Phrygian cap. However, going into not too long ago, the last couple, even 1 or 2 centuries ago, especially in Italy and other parts, they were still wearing the Phrygian cap. Was quite a common thing, especially in Sicily and southern Italy. Sphinxes flanking the pediment, guarded by sphinxes, very much like the Lammasu, the lion with the man's head and the wings, often found in pairs and guarding sacred places and treasuries especially. And so in Winnipeg, the Sphinx is there, and the hieroglyph cartouche of Tutmosis III, and a reference to the sun god Ra, giver of life. The same sort of symbols you can find on Rosicrucian, tracing boards, Freemasonic, Oddfellows, Druids. And I've also noticed, I'm not 100% firm in this, but ionic columns will very often, more often than what might be usual, there will be a connection with sphinxes and ionic columns. So the Art Gallery in New South Wales, which has ionic columns, there are 2 Greek sphinxes on the just opposite the road, and the same as in Winnipeg, where the exterior has the ionic columns and the sphinxes guarding. But on top of the Lieutenant Governor's building, the Ark of the Covenant. In earlier episodes, I mentioned the measurements in the Winnipeg building, but in this video I'll just be dealing with the symbols and how so often these will go back to ancient Greece, but more specifically ancient Egypt. The Greeks great culture. They did a lot of stuff, but so much of their symbols and their knowledge was inherited from Egypt. And focus on the pelmet there, which comes from the Archet hieroglyph, and Archet was also one of the 3 seasons in the Egyptian or the Nile flooding cycle. And the pelmet again will be referred throughout multiple times throughout the Winnipeg building, but we're going to see it also in Sydney on many of the important buildings, especially those with very well documented connections to Freemasonry. And there's also a connection with Griffins eating the pelmet. Griffins also being, in ancient times, being guardians of treasuries, guardians of mines as well. A little bit of a graphic there of how the evolution of the Lammasu Griffin guardian looking over temples and more often than not, especially like in Greek times, the ionic columns and the Griffin Sphinx. In Freemasonic temples, Rosicrucian temples to this day, the Sphinxes, Griffins or Lammasus being guardians standing outside the door. And Salt Lake City Masonic temple, they have Egyptian columns, the lotus column, which sort of makes me... I've been trying to decipher how the Egyptian columns translate into the Greek style, classic Greek columns, but that's something else for the moment. So sphinxes, ionic columns. Ionic represents feeling. In Freemasonic tracing boards you have the 5 columns and each one is connected to a sense, sight, smell, etc. Inside the Winnipeg building there are 2 bison guarding, but they are simply a local. They've just replaced the Griffin. And in Sydney, the old Grace Brothers building on Broadway, again the same symbols. They might be slightly different in style, but they're always there. St Mary's Cathedral. There were 6 of these Fraser fountains built around Sydney, but the most interesting is this one next to St Mary's Cathedral. The Griffins symbolism, just as I mentioned with the caduceus, the cornucopia, and the beehive, each one of them also being esoteric occult group linked. And another connection being the Palmet, so Royal Prince Alfred Hospital in Sydney, 100% Freemasonic origins. It's well known, it's no secret at all. But now as we move on, the Legislative Assembly, the main hall, has a horned Moses, reference to Moses being the giver of, the bringer of law. Moses symbol, now there's all sorts of variations as to interpretations as exactly to what those horns mean. Now they're certainly not devil horns. They've got to do more with emanations of light, as in he's bringing some, it's not, he's like bringing good law, he's bringing godly law, let's say, and that's one of the meanings for it. And another important symbol connected with Burnley in England. I'll go through some of the sites where this horn, now you can clearly see that it's beams of light, not devilish horns. Now that's one of these things that sort of gets under my skin a bit, that there's so many sites out there devoted to this is all satanic, it's all evil. I must strongly disagree with that and say that these people who say that don't know what they're talking about. They don't understand, they don't know the mythology, they don't know the law. They simply see something, they hear something from David Icke, and off you go. They make up this is all evil. Classic example being discussing the lady riding the beast. That's Europa riding the bull, which is a symbol outside the European Parliament building. So many sites call it a devil symbol. It's Europa on Zeus. That's what it is. It's a European symbol, especially. That's why it's so important. But as we move around the world, the Horn Moses symbol, but U.S. Capitol building, where they make the law, they have Moses. He's he brought the tablets of law. That's what it means. And he went up the mountain and spoke to God. So also in the Jewish temple in Indianapolis, an important city, very rare for a Jewish synagogue to have those have it in picture form, but that's one of a few places you will find it. As we look, from the Vulgate of version of the Bible, Exodus 34:29, when Moses came down from Mount Sinai, he held two tables of testimony, the Ten Commandments, and he had just spoken to God, and so he did not know it, but his face was shining with the light of God. That's one of, and these horns are, after his interaction with the creator of creator, he's illuminated it, and then it's so strong that it's like beaming out as light. It is not devil horns. Full stop. There's no arguments on that one. You just got to read the books rather than make baseless accusations. Another connection with Moses and to the Greek god Asclepius. He's a Greek god of healing, son of Apollo. Just as often as you'll see the two snakes around the rod for medical symbol, you're also going to see the one snake around the rod. That comes from the brazen serpent of Moses. British Medical Association in Macquarie Street, Sydney, across the road from Governor Philip Fountain I mentioned earlier. But it's also, as with so many of these things, it's an astronomical symbol connecting directly to a constellation, such as the 13th sign of the zodiac. Most people would think that there's 12. There's not. There's actually 13. That's a whole other thing. But Leo Moll, famous sculptor here, there's a large sculpture park in Winnipeg full of his sculptures. And we see another one at the University of Manitoba. And we can see how it connects again with these esoteric symbols. And, so Zeus and Europa riding the bull. When many of these paranoid sites will say that it's a beastly symbol, no, okay. Also Leo Mole Sculpture Park, the two bears. It's a constellation sign, the little bear and the big bear. That's where the North Star is. But now I want to do some connections between Sydney and especially the Royal Botanic Gardens in Sydney and the Leo Mole Sculpture Park, where we have okay, so lumberjacks, a balanced pair. Now in a few moments I'm going to come to Sydney, and then I'm going to start to compare these two and find, for instance, mirroring. We have these two balanced twins, the same in Winnipeg, the Leo Mole Sculpture Park, mother and child, the Earth Mother sculpture, where the dancer in the Winnipeg Sculpture Garden, La Ballerina sculpture in the Royal Botanic Garden, Sydney. Just as in the numbers of the buildings with these connections, astronomical connections, which I've talked about so recently, there's also very strong symbolic symbols in these places. Another one being the spiral, especially the fire spiral in these parks. So in the Royal Botanic Gardens, we can see it from the air. Also a city I've been talking about, one of the classic great capital cities of the world, based on this design from a blank design. There's a fire reference, but also connected to the phoenix. Something else in Canberra, Brasilia, the spiral, and just off to the side we see a phoenix reference. Now that reference is the Greek letter psi. So we'll see it drawn as a phoenix, but also in other variations we'll slightly see it, but it's the same element. It's psi and phi. So outside the National War Memorial in Canberra, Australia, the phoenix and the phi symbol. So from the air you'll notice that it's a pentagram, which is a phi. In math it's the most beautiful representation of it geometrically. But also in Washington, outside the Union Station, another site designed by Daniel Burnham, the same thing goes on again. Phoenix and phi built into this, and the compass and square, as we compare the Washington and Canberra as well. Sydney, Australia, and Winnipeg, Canberra, also you might call them cities of obelisk, because there's so many obelisks around, going older ones, but also up into the new times. So we just have a comparison of some of them here. Obelisks being classic ancient Egyptian symbols, and very, again, just Sydney and Winnipeg, this Hermetic design template is based on ancient symbols, ancient measurements, and ancient thinking. And it's especially in recent times, people have this very sadly this thing has developed where modern science we're so far advanced, and that that we're somehow this great advanced culture, and where these people were very simple and primitive. Just remember that these cultures were around for hundreds and hundreds of years. Since the Industrial Revolution, our advanced intelligent culture has basically screwed the world over. Not just the physical pollution, but the mental pollution that we've brought onto ourselves, and the way that we've disharmonious society, one totally based on war, totally based on usury and growth at all costs. Growth comes before everything else. And that's why I find, so I'm personally not a member of any group, Rosicrucian, Oddfellow, Mason. I'm not connected to them, but I very much admire what they're trying to do in the design of cities, as opposed to the rationalist modernist style, which is not functional, and it's very ugly, it's soulless, and it's purely based on money. And now when a king would build would build their temple, they didn't live in these temples. These were built as for a community thing. It was much bigger than themselves. That's something we don't do anymore. If you look at the ruling elite now, they just build grand palaces for themselves, maybe throw a few bucks at some crappy little park, but that's about all. So also, well, in this last few seconds of section, I've been comparing the Hyde Park obelisk and the Cleopatra's Needle in London, guarded by sphinxes and references to Isis, and especially the Golden Gate and the Silver Gate, which themselves are references to the constellations Taurus and Scorpio. Another interesting thing, astronomical connection, June 3rd, 1914, the foundation stone was laid. That was when Venus and Mercury were aligned in the sky above Winnipeg. Venus, the female, and Mercury, Hermes, Orphoth. And here we are in Manitoba, and we go to the Dina celebration circle, which is dedicated to the First Nations people of Canada. It's a modern day Stonehenge, and they're full of astronomical connections. But in Alberta, Canada, in North America, we have these things, a sun wheel. So they're in Canada, they're also in America. They're clearly astronomically aligned, and they're just as old, if not older, than Stonehenge. So often, first the native people of Australia, New Zealand, and the Americas are tended to be looked down upon, very Eurocentric view, but they were doing some great stuff long time ago, and I think it's about time that they need to be recognised. But the armatures here, the Adena, the literature on it. So it was opened on the autumn equinox. The armatures around there have eye holes which will line up with astronomical bodies. Each one of the plinths around there have their constellation symbols, quite literally, and some of them may be a little bit hidden, but they're still there. So, but interesting about this particular monument is that it's a First Nations monument, but we're going to see African, Chinese, Asian, and many other cultures of the world represented in here, which is something that you'll see in occult groups and Freemasons, Baha'i, Rosicrucians. They were interested in comparative religions, world religions. They were trying to, as opposed to the society at the time, which is very insular, racist, if you want to say, supremacist, and not just European societies. You're going to see that all groups. So more often than not, will look in on themselves and look badly on the other, and the otherness being bad, as where these groups and this architecture is about inclusiveness and about learning from other people and about seeing how there is a common source to all these religions of the world. They're not just some random collection where a king here and a priest here will just invent some fairy story. This can be traced quite literally through the measurements, as I've done in some previous videos. Isis and Virgo, connections, constellations. Each one of these, it's astronomy, it's geometry, it's music, and it's arithmetic. Aeolian lyre was one of the features of this celebration circle. So it's basically they string up a few wires, and if it's designed well, when the wind goes through them, it creates this wonderful sound. But the sound also sort of literally penetrates your body. The people who comment on being near one will talk about how it's more than just hearing it; you'll feel it through your entire soul. So sun and moon as well. So we have constellations, but in this particular one, they're using an African moon goddess, and was where they had the Aztec sun wheel, inclusive of all nations who, again, have, they sort of, if it's all random, but all these separate cultures across time always seem to come back to these certain symbols. Now, sun and moon might be obvious, but the arrangement of constellations and other things, that's not that can't be easily explained away by coincidence. And just short distance away from the celebration circle, there's also this is a monument, and you can see the shapes there, references to science, and it's almost like a sundial. So as the sun moves around, it will cast a shadow through and illuminate these different symbols. Some of them are modern science symbols, but the people who built the Great Pyramid were not primitive. They built one of the most perfect buildings ever made in all of human history, and they did it at the official beginning of human civilization, which has to throw a whole big question mark over the official beginning of civilization. Amongst other places, but just focus on the Great Pyramid, it was built with such great size and such great perfection, and yeah, the whole story of the pyramid stinks. If the official history of it is embarrassingly, cringe-worthingly bad, and I really don't know how the establishment people live with themselves and talk about it and try and dismiss the engineering and the mathematics in there. Well, for one thing, it tells me that the archaeology people failed maths and science, and that's why they went into archaeology. And sundials, so another comparison where sundials in Sydney and sundials in Winnipeg, especially in these important parks. Also the use of the 5 orders of architecture. So the classic Greek orders of architecture, there's 3. There's Doric, Ionic and Corinthian. The Romans added Tuscan and composite. And composite is basically a Corinthian column that's a little bit more elaborate. In Winnipeg, the Pool of a Black Star underneath, that has it's the Tuscan columns, which are connections to hearing. But as we move up, we'll see that Ionic on the outside, Tuscan in the Pool of a Black Star, which has very special audio properties. It's a whispering chamber, and it has Tuscan, which are connected to hearing. On the outside, Ionic columns, which are reference to feeling. Ionic columns also represent female, and the swirls at the top are said to represent the simple adornment that of a woman. She would, so the curls on her hair, and as we move up to rotunda, we have Corinthian columns. So throughout all 5 orders of architecture are represented in the Winnipeg Manitoba Legislative Building, and at the top. But and so Freemasonic tracing boards is one of the most obvious places to find this. If you look through any Freemasonic temple, or such as the Freemasonic Masonic Centre in Sydney, they have 5 rooms, 5 public like lecture rooms, or small auditoriums, and they're named after the 5 orders: Tuscan, Ionic, Doric, Corinthian, and composite. I've labelled that wrong. That's not the Department of Education. That's the Colonial Secretary's building. The Department of Education building's next door. But we see again this class. So 3 floors with the 3 Greek orders of architecture: Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. And so this is a step now. One of the oldest places where you'll find this is the Colosseum in Rome, where it's Doric, Ionic and Corinthian on the 3 levels. So this style of architecture is not in the modern era or even the Renaissance era. It goes back to ancient times. The old State Bank building of New South Wales, we have an Athena statue donated by the people of Athens for the Sydney 2000 Olympics, but again, the 3 orders of architecture. Royal Prince Alfred Hospital, big shout out to them. I was treated there. Awesome team, awesome hospital, especially to Dr. Joy Ho and the people in the haematology department. The Royal Prince Alfred Hospital was founded after a donation given by the local Freemason Grandmaster. The son of Queen Victoria come to visit Australia, and while he was attending a picnic held by the local Freemasons, there was an attempt on his life by Henry James O'Farrell, and the Grand Master of the temple, Freemason Grand Master of Sydney, intervened and basically rescued the prince. The prince gave a large donation, and then he passed a donation on to create the Royal Prince Alfred Hospital, which I mentioned has the palmet on top, but also has the three classical Greek orders of architecture represented through the columns. Now, it's not just about Doric, Ionic and Corinthian, and not just about a column type. There also has to do with music, and it also has to do with measurements. Doric and Ionic ancient Greek measurements. It's maybe not well known, but it's very much real, and anyone who's sort of into that will know it. It's not a modern creation. These measurements, people who study older temples find this stuff all the time, so it's not one of those made up things which I had seen some people comment on before. And again, anyway, so again, Freemasonic tracing boards, we can see how Doric, Corinthian and Ionic, or in some form, will always be connected together, and also some sun and moon symbols are standard. And in this particular tracing board, now on the bottom right hand corner, you have to zoom in, and it's partly obscured by the flags, but we see the 5 orders of architecture with represented there as well. The 5 orders are very important, and we can see a tracing board here: Tuscan, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian and Composite, and how they relate to the 5 senses as well. So more than just the architecture, and more than just the measurement, and more than just the 5 senses, these also relate to musical scales, and to so much more. It's I could talk quite a while just on this particular topic, but old tracing boards, even new tracing boards, the same theme continues again. These tracing boards are full of hidden symbols and hidden knowledge, especially astronomical. So usually when you see the 2 columns, they're going to have 2 spheres on top, and they're tilted. One represents the Earth, and the other represents the heavens. And you can literally see it, because there'll be a band going around with the signs of the zodiac on that band. So it's not, and as where the other one even has a map on the Earth, it's not. It's obviously there. Again, I've seen some people sort of dispute this and say it, but really I don't know what the hell they're talking about. St. Luke's in Liverpool, this free 5-step thing. So we have the 7 liberal arts, we have the 5 steps representing the 5 orders, and we have 3 steps representing the 3 initial steps of initiation. But to focus on the 7 steps, the 7 levels, in Winnipeg, you'll see these sculptures where they'll be separated by 7 levels, so smaller town sculptures. But in Canberra, the design of Canberra by Walter Burley Griffin even had the Egyptian ankh in there, but there's literally you can find again the 7 levels moving around from the outside. Isis cults, there were 7 levels of initiation. In Inanna, Ishtar had to pass through 7 gates to reach the underworld. 7 in Rosicrucian, they have the 7 notes and 144 leading to 1008. Alchemical and earlier esoteric boards, even Isaac Newton the alchemist, you see one of his diagrams where we have 7 around the 7. But the most obvious, I think the most important one to focus on is the 7 liberal arts: astronomy, music, geometry, arithmetic, as well as logic, rhetoric and grammar, to make up the 4. So the 4 higher arts are those of astronomy, music, arithmetic and geometry, but rhetoric, grammar as well, also important because it's got to do with law, but also with logic as well. So it's okay. So the various depictions in many churches, cathedrals around the place where you're going to see this 7, but also more often than not you're going to find a connection with like a horned Moses figure connected with the 7 liberal arts. Apollo and Diana, or Artemis. So Albrecht Dürer is he's like a super cool guy in this type of area way back when, especially dealing with geometry and some proportions, but also very heavily into symbolism. Melancholia 1, for instance, that's at 14 to 11 scale, but phi and pi. But Athanasius Kircher, Jesuit scholar, his works, if you look at them carefully and then compare them to the later tracing boards for the Oddfellows, Masons, etc., you can see those symbols established in there earlier. So between Dürer and Kircher, before the first formal lodges, in their artworks and in their, you'll find each of the elements within the tracing boards. So it's okay. And most people would think that these symbols, it's sort of got to do with mythology. It's that there's no science, there's no knowledge to it. Utterly wrong. It's just so wrong that it's cringeworthy again. If you study it, you'll see it, and you can measure it, and you can test it. It's to say that it's not is only people who say that is the ones who don't know and don't study. Also, there are some people who don't want to know. They're very firmly, they have a worldview where they've been raised in the current schooling system, which tries to diminish anything which isn't new and electronic, is somehow old and primitive, which sadly is not the case, and sadly for them, they're missing out on so much. So that's a little rant on that subject. But Hermetic symbolism, occult and esoteric, sort of you could bunch them all in together. But at the very least, this architecture, it's beautiful. Anyone who wants to look at one of those old temples or one of these old sandstone buildings, and then compare it to one of the new monstrosities of steel and concrete and squares, which are designed on economic considerations as opposed to anything. Well, they're designed by base motives, as where these are designed upon much higher motives, and they use multiple levels of knowledge. So the building itself is literally a textbook. It's also a book on mythology. It's also a book on moral philosophy as well. So this one building has so much in it, and it uses proportions which also create beautiful audio properties. So it's visually stunning. It's to the ear, it's beautiful. To all of the senses, it should be beautiful. That's one of the points, is where again these concrete and steel things are just friggin' ugly. A little quick comparison now with Sydney and Indianapolis. Very separate cities, separate parts of the world, but we can just to highlight how there's a certain template that's used. And so the main park in Sydney and the main park in Indianapolis, we have war memorials with very similar designs. We have an obelisk placed in essentially this same place. We have a fountain and these four figures on the fountain, and we also have churches on the northeast corner. Also in Indianapolis, just to the side, a little bit lower, is the Scottish Rite Cathedral. Sydney was redesigned by Governor Macquarie, and Francis Greenway was his architect. Two of the churches designed by Francis Greenway. Yeah, so St James in Sydney, and both of these were Freemasons. Now, Governor Macquarie arrived here freely. Francis Greenway was a convict. Uh, I've mentioned earlier, Governor Macquarie was a very liberal guy, and he broke the English class system and allowed people like convicts like Francis Greenway to re-enter society and achieve government jobs. And again, so Liverpool and Sydney, by essentially the same people, have essentially the same design. Now, older fountains, but these new fountains, the chessboard, in the same sort of place. The church is basically in the same place, and you might notice that both of them are also not perfectly aligned with north. This is another important feature. For instance, I mentioned Frank Albo being wrong on some points of Winnipeg. Now, the Manitoba Legislative Building, the main avenue leading out of there, is not aligned to true north. Frank Albo will call this an accident. It's not, because so many other cities, especially beautiful cities such as Manitoba, have this 6-degree offset. And this in itself you can trace back to ancient times as well, especially Luxor and Karnak temples. But in Liverpool, we have this statue of Macquarie, and there's all tools and symbols inside. Each one of these you can then use a tracing board, and you'll see how each one of them is a reference to one of the rites, one of the passages in Freemasonry, but also to do especially with weights and measures and architecture, surveying, and these very science. These are the foundations of science. People were doing science, astronomy, and other sciences at a very high level before electronics come in. If anything, calculators and the electronics have dumbed us down, because they, with a piece of string and some very simple tools, they were able to do amazing observations and do some amazing architecture without laser guided, without calculators, without spreadsheets. And I would ask the modern crop of people who sort of poo-poo this older stuff and call it primitive, well, I'll give you a handful of simple tools and you do this, and 99% of them are incapable of doing their inverted commas science without all these added tools, which in itself really says that they don't really, if you can't do it without a computer, then you can't really do it. These people could, and that's why we have to preserve this knowledge and preserve these symbols, because God forbid something happens, all of the new crop without their electronic aids and without all their fancy pants technology and equipment will be helpless, absolutely helpless. As where the few people who understand this and who have studied this and apply this will know it quite well. And also, all of these things have double meaning. So a lot of these symbols and tools in the tracing boards are also constellations, which is another way that this knowledge is preserved. If you understand how the constellations work, you can create time. Even by night you can measure time. Alright, so anyway, that's a bit off topic. So Liverpool in Sydney, this fountain, most people would look at this fountain and think it's childish and simple. It's one of these hidden in plain sight things. Again, if you learn to read the symbols, you're going to find that they're in one form or another, even in this cartoonish style, or whether it's in a very serious, austere government building, they're always there. And that's another part of this, in that you need to be initiated into this. You need to learn this through steps. And if you give someone something they don't appreciate it, if they learn it and earn it, then they appreciate it and they'll take it forward, which is another one of it. Let's call it the modern moral sort of elements of this. Again, in Liverpool, there's a war memorial. The broken column. Broken column is connected to a life cut short. It's got to be connected with funerals, and it actually goes back to Greek and Roman times at the very least, especially with regarding the origin of the Corinthian order of architecture, which is strongly connected with death and rejuvenation, and with funerals especially. Yeah, so this has been, but just in the Liverpool area, Liverpool, Sydney, how, which was Governor Macquarie, Francis Greenway, Freemason design, how the elements within the town plan, and this town plan is very much connected with the Indianapolis town plan, but how they all draw, their origins can be found through modern Freemasonic tracing boards, and this particular board, you might call it's a modern one. In modern, I mean in the last few hundred years, before the Grand Lodges made the Freemasonic rites were varied from lodge to lodge, but in the last few hundred years they've been brought standardized, let's say. But again, for those with eyes to see, and if you think, well, this doesn't exist, you're never going to see anything. Okay, if you don't believe it's there, you can't accept it. You're not going to look for it. You're not going to find it. That goes for, well, in symbolism and spirituality, but that also extends to material and science. Now, if you do not believe something's there and you don't study it, well, then you're not going to find it. It's simple as that. The great leaps forward in science were people looking for things that everyone said is not there, like the black swan myth, for instance. There's no black swan. It's, this guy's chasing black swans was an insult to someone that is off chasing the fairies, so to speak. And then what happened when they arrived here in Australia, Swan River in Western Australia, they found the black swan. So now, really, the black swan, should be a symbol for closed-minded people who say it's impossible and it doesn't exist. Be very careful when you say something doesn't exist, because you're going to be made a fool of quite quickly. And I think a lot of the people who poo-poo this are very, very foolish, very, very closed-minded, and I have to, you have to ask questions about, like they'll say, oh, it's not scientific, and there's no evidence here. Well, there is evidence there, and the evidence is everywhere. It's evidence that can be measured. When these people who deny it are basically brainwashed fools, and that they're quite often so rude and so quite dismissive speaks to me about their lack of knowledge, and that they really have no position to be being spokesman of science, because it was out of these groups that the modern scientific age was born. The heroes of the modern scientific age, almost to the man, were Rosicrucians, Freemasons, Oddfellows, or Druids, or one of these other groups, all were very much inspired by them. Okay, so yeah, all right. So I've been going off on a bit of a rant then, but now as we come to a close, so in small town Liverpool, it is a perfect example of how this applies on the bigger scale. Liverpool, founded by a Freemason, designed by a Freemason, and the same patterns against, so Sydney, Liverpool, or Winnipeg. City Beautiful movement. If you follow that through and look at the architects and what they were responsible for, you'll find this over again. Okay, so the Winnipeg, you see there's that offset there. Frank Albo described that as a mistake. That's not a mistake. It's can be found in many cities. It's not in all of these cities that have this. It's a key part of it. This offset between the main axes and the one leading off to other structures. For instance, old map of New Orleans. Montreal. So in Canada, you're going to see it in a lot of cities. You're going to in the US and also in Australia, and which itself leads back to Karnak, Raleigh, North Carolina. Each of these cities as well, I've touched on in some earlier episodes, where they'll have a very Freemasonic 33, 66 or 99 feet wide streets, which in themselves connects to metrology or measurements and ratios of sun, earth and moon. Canberra as well at so the Northbourne Avenue is not true north, it's slightly offset from true north, and that in itself, Karnak and Luxor. So if few researchers have noticed this in the ancient world, but if you follow it through, you're going to find it in all over the place now. And again, so much of this comes from ancient knowledge, the Greeks and the Egyptians. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed or found something interesting, something to learn from there. I'll bring this video up to a close now, because it's one of these topics that really takes a huge amount of time to go through. I've just really gone through them quickly. I posted this video some time ago, but just with music and without the narration, hoping that the narration added to it rather than took away from it. But also just want to leave you with the thought that the modern materialist will try and deny so much of this, and they won't like it because, well, I don't know why, but if you examine it and if you study it a little bit and if you look through it, this old system of knowledge has some great things in it, some things worth preserving, some things worth knowing. Now, I'm not saying we got to throw away the modern world. I'm a modernist in that way. Science is great, technology is great. I'm not saying get rid of it, but what I am saying is that let's not throw the old away just because it's new. Now, that's another problem with our society. I think the new iPhone comes out, so my old one is suddenly worthless now. No, the old stuff is good. Yeah, there's value to it, and we shouldn't lose that. And okay, so I'll leave it with that and say goodbye. I hope you enjoyed. Have a good one.